things and waiting for our live stream to start, and then we will be good to go. Okay, I can see it. It's thinking. It really wants to start us live on YouTube, Linda.
I'm trying to be a YouTube star, so you're helping me.
Okay, there we go. You can see us there. Okay, here we go. So welcome everybody. I'm Dr. Deirdre Pickrell. I'm the Dean of Student Success for Yorkville University and the Toronto Film School and Acting Director of our Career Services Department. And I'm absolutely thrilled to welcome you today to one of our bi-weekly career services webinars. This one is Preparing for Work, Ace the Interview. Our presenter is Linda Folster. Linda's a longtime career advisor here at Yorkville University and Toronto Film School. She's based out here in British Columbia with me and has worked with thousands of clients, worked in the nonprofit and post-secondary sector, and Linda's going to introduce herself in a minute. I've also got with us on your screen here Natalia Markman, who is our career advisor attached to the Toronto Film School, and Alexi Verikin, who's our career advisor attached to Yorkville University Steeles. But collectively, we are your career services team, so it doesn't matter what program you're in, where in the country you live, where in the country your degree or diploma is conferred from. We're the team that will help you prepare and find work. And so with no further ado and nothing else from me, I'm going to turn it over to Linda. We are all going to mute ourselves and, well, not Linda, and turn our cameras off. I will be monitoring the chat and the Q&A, and Linda's got some interactive activities too. So Linda, with no further ado, over to you.
Thanks so much for the warm introduction, Deirdre. I'm getting used to doing these webinars and I'm actually starting to really look forward to it. Can you advance to the next slide, please? Okay, so before I get started, I just want to give you a little bit of detail about my background. Deirdre mentioned I'm new to the team. I joined on September of last year. And I've worked around 13 years now advising, more than 1,000 clients who've been in career transition. As Deirdre mentioned, it's mostly been in the nonprofit sector. But prior to joining Yorkville, I've also done some work with clients in the post-secondary environment. As you can see from the slide, I have a lot of credentials. I'm certified to administer and interpret a whole wide range of career assessments, and I'm also what's called a certified career development practitioner. Plus, I have a master's in adult education. And I've also been an entrepreneur for around 12 years. And so because of that, I have also worked as a business advisor for around 6 years with hundreds of entrepreneurs who are at the startup stage. Next slide, please. So here's a sobering quote. It takes an average of 10 interviews to lead to an offer. So let me clarify. This doesn't necessarily mean 10 interviews with 10 different employers. The 10 interviews could be with anywhere from 2 to 4 employers, or maybe even more, assuming that employers conduct up to 2 or 3 interviews with each candidate before they hire. That's not always the case. So I just want to normalize for you. Sometimes you end up having a great interview and you feel really excited about the possibilities and you start daydreaming and imagining yourself in the job, your commute, or your Zoom presence these days, only to discover that they ended up hiring someone else. And unfortunately, you often don't know why. And this typically makes you feel down and you start doubting yourself. And this is why job search has been compared to a roller coaster. There are lots of emotional highs and lows. Next slide, please. So we use Mentimeter, which is an engagement software. And if you've joined our webinars in the past, you'll be familiar with this. The process is for you to enter the Mentimeter website into a device. It can be your laptop or it can be your cell phone. So you first get onto the site, and then you enter the code that's listed at the top of the screen, and that will allow you to answer the occasional question that I'm going to pose. So here's the first one. I'm just curious to know how many people have had an interview in Canada before, a job interview, because I'm aware that we have some international students in the audience. So just fill out your answer and we'll see the answers populating live. Okay. So I've got a few people who've responded so far. Okay, we're starting to see the answers roll in. It looks like most people who are in the audience who are responding have had an interview in Canada before. It's fun to see the answers keep rolling in. This helps me to get a sense of who's in the audience, and it also helps you to engage with the material. Okay, Deirdre, maybe you want to advance to the next slide, please. So I really love this quote. I think it's very appropriate, actually. Job interviews are like first dates. Good impressions count. Awkwardness can occur. Outcomes are unpredictable. This is so true. I like that this just normalizes the whole experience. There's actually a lot of parallels between job search and dating. And one of them is that just like in dating, it's always a good idea to be yourself. The key is to just be your best self. The way that I look at it is that just like in dating, there needs to be mutual chemistry and also a fit on both sides. And if you start to think about it this way, it helps to reduce the magnitude of the lows on the roller coaster, because you start to realize that this is the type of fit that's really hard to find. And it's also entirely possible to find it, and it's totally worth it to hold out for this. So during the webinar, I'm going to explain the typical elements of a job interview and how to best prepare to show your best self. Next slide, please. So the prospect of job interviews can be equally exciting and also nerve-wracking. You have so much riding on this because, let's face it, the primary reason that you decided to do your degree was to get a great job. Some of you might be new to Canada and maybe you've never had an interview before in our country. Others of you might have never even had an interview before, period. Or maybe you've had bad experiences with interviews in the past, or perhaps it's just been a really long time since you've had one, maybe years, and maybe you just feel rusty. And when you add to this that the pandemic has created high unemployment and a very competitive labor market, whatever your situation, it can feel like a lot of pressure and it can generate tremendous anxiety. And by the way, I just want you to know that I have been there too. Even though I'm a career advisor, I'm no different. And I want you to imagine for a moment what it would feel like if you no longer felt that interviews were a mystery to you or some kind of a test that you think you don't have any chance of passing, that it was possible to understand how they work and what goes into preparing so that you can show your best self. Can you imagine how amazing it would feel to focus on your excitement instead of your fears? It's possible, and it boils down to two things: awareness and preparation. And I'm about to share with you some information that's going to help you understand the psychology of interviews from the perspective of the employer, so that you can fundamentally learn how to treat every single interview question as an opportunity to answer the only real question that interviewers have at the end of the day underneath it all. And that is, how can you be of value to me? So I'm going to share with you a ton of information and also some really good strategies that you can use so that you can position yourself in the best possible way, hopefully so that you will increase your chances of getting a job offer. And if it doesn't happen, then that job was simply not meant to be your job. And the one that was meant for you will come along eventually. And after working with over 1,000 job seekers, I can actually promise you that. Next slide, please. So here's what we'll be covering during the webinar. First, it's important to think about not just your experience as a candidate, but also to understand what employers are up against in this process. I'll explain to you about the 3 stages of interviewing: the pre-interview, interview, and the post-interview. And this is going to include what to expect and how to manage yourself. Also, there's a wide variety of interview formats, and we're going to learn about these. Plus, we'll examine both typical and illegal interview questions, along with some suggested ways of handling these. And finally, I'm going to explain to you our mock interview service, which is available through Career Services, because this is a fantastic opportunity for you to practice and get some feedback before you do a real interview. So you can see that the learning outcomes on the right-hand side are linked to the topics. And the one that I want to highlight in particular is that you're going to learn why employers ask certain questions. Because if you start from a place of understanding their motives, it's going to help you to start thinking about and preparing meaningful answers, and ones that will hopefully avoid generating any doubt in the employer's mind, because you're going to know how to avoid any topics that are red flags or concerns to employers. Next slide, please. So here's that question I mentioned earlier on the employer's mind. How can you be valuable to me? I can't overemphasize this, because every part of the job search process, starting with customizing your resume and writing a cover letter, to interviewing and negotiating a job offer, centers around this question. But that doesn't mean that employment is a one-sided deal. What it does mean is that until you have a job offer, it's your job to demonstrate your value to prospective employers. Of course, it's assumed that you're going to deliver that value once you're on the job. Next slide, please. So many people think of an interview as some sort of a stressful test that we're not sure we can pass, and that our job is to guess exactly who they want us to be and what the correct answers are to the questions. So if that's what's on your mind, it's no wonder that this provokes so much anxiety. I think it's helpful to remind yourself of a few things. First of all you can do is your best and prepare, and you do have control over this aspect. And secondly, an interview is really a conversation about fit. So that means that you have something to offer. Otherwise, you wouldn't be invited to the interview in the first place. Plus, what you have to offer has value. And when you realize this, you can start to see yourself as an equal with the employer. And really, when you think about it and break it down, one of 3 scenarios is going to result. Either the employer will decide that you're not a good fit and you won't get a job offer, or you'll decide that the job isn't a good fit, and if they offered it to you, you wouldn't accept it. Believe it or not, this is an option to you. Or the best case scenario is that you both decide it's a great fit, you'll get an offer, and you'll accept it. Next slide, please. So I want to check in with you. I'm curious how you feel about job interviews. Are you very nervous, somewhat nervous, or confident? Keep them coming. So far, it looks like, okay, that's interesting to see. The majority of people are somewhat nervous. And then there's a reasonably equal split with a little more on the side of very nervous. Okay. Well, regardless of where you sit on this pie chart, we can really, really help you with this. Okay. Next slide, please, Deirdre. So if we look at what underpins hiring decisions from the employer perspective, it boils down to three things that employers want to know about you. They want to know, can you do the job? In other words, do you have the skills? Secondly, they want to know, will you do the job? And what that means is they want to know if when you're on the job, you're going to show initiative and enthusiasm. Are you going to be able to creatively solve problems? And then the third thing they want to know is, do you want to do the job? Because no matter how technically qualified you might be, fitting in is even more important. A lot of people don't realize this, that employers will take a chance on a less qualified candidate if the person demonstrates enthusiasm for learning and if the person appears to fit in. So remember too some other things, like the fact that interviewers, some of them are very skilled and experienced, but actually most are not. In some cases, interviews are either very open-ended without much structure, or even the interviewer talks too much. Whereas on the flip side of that, others are very planned and structured and professional. And in those kind of interviews, there's a chance for mutual discussion and dialogue. So an important part of preparing is trying to understand the employer's perspective. And here are some points that I'm going to share with you that you may or may not be aware of. The hiring process actually costs a lot, and it takes a minimum of 1 to 2 months before the person starts their new job. Posting a job on websites like Indeed costs employers anywhere from 10 cents to $5 per click. That's per click, not per candidate. So think about that. How many jobs have you clicked on and not even applied for? And employers pay each time you do this. Can you imagine the cost? Plus, job postings are sometimes up for 30 to 60 days, although probably less in today's competitive labor market, but that's a long time. And then another thing is that most hires, when they start their job, you get a 3 to 6 month probationary period. And this gives the employer an out if things don't work out. But during this time, lots of money is invested in training and wages. It can be in the tens of thousands of dollars, and the pressure is on. And it takes an average of at least 6 months for a new hire to become fully productive in the job. So guess what? This actually makes the interviewer really nervous. So it's not just you who's nervous, because if it doesn't work out, they have to let you go and begin the process all over again, which wastes a lot of time and money. Next slide, please. So now let's examine the 3 interview stages, starting with the pre-interview. This is the period between when you're invited to interview and the day it happens. And during this time, it's important to research the company. You can check their website. This will help you be prepared for questions that are inevitable, like, what do you know about our company? Or why do you want to work here? And it'll also help you to prepare your own questions for the interviewer, which is something that you should always do. Now, during the pandemic, most interviews are being conducted by video or phone. So if you'll be attending an in-person interview, plan out in advance how you're going to get there. Are you going to drive? Are you going to take the bus? And that's going to help you to figure out what time you need to leave so that you'll arrive in time. You want to arrive around 10 minutes early, ideally. And you don't want to get lost. But you know what? This goes for virtual interviews as well. Make sure to log in at least 5 minutes early. You'll also want to practice your responses to some common interview questions. And I'm going to be covering what some of those are in a couple of moments. And for those of you who are going to be doing face-to-face interviews, you'll want to set aside your resume and a reference list. You might have a portfolio to bring, and you decide ahead of time what you're going to wear. So in terms of what to wear, don't be either too casual or too formal. Research the company and the industry and try to fit in with what their norms are. And in fact, you might even want to take that up a notch to show effort and professionalism. And again, if you're going to be doing an in-person interview, which are kind of rare these days, make sure you avoid fragrances because people can be sensitive to them. So the next stage is the actual interview. If your interview is in person, during the pandemic, obviously firm handshakes go out the door. But regardless of whether in person or on a screen, throughout the interview, make sure to maintain good posture, smile, and maintain eye contact. And I have a little trick to share with you. If you look in between the interviewer's eyebrows, this comes across to the other person as good eye contact that's not too intense. Make sure you turn off or silence your cell phone, and vibrate is not recommended either. It's very distracting and unprofessional. And listen carefully to the interviewer. Make sure that you understand each question. And if you don't understand a question, don't be shy to ask them to repeat it or to clarify it. Try to discipline yourself not to go off on any tangents, and don't take any longer than 2 minutes to answer a question, because answering too long leaves a bad impression. If you can't think of an answer or you go blank, just ask for a moment to think about it. And you can also ask to return to that question later. Make sure that at every opportunity you show how your background relates to the position and the company. You want to make these connections for employers because that's what they actually want to hear. Don't hesitate to share accomplishments. This is not bragging. There's no room for modesty in interviews, and that might feel uncomfortable for you. But remember that it's your job to sell yourself. And make sure that you ask questions about the position and the company. Because remember, you're also interviewing them. And accepting a job, after all, is a really big decision for you. So you should be using the interview to find out more. And make sure that you don't ask questions about pay or benefits until you get an offer. And come prepared with at least 3 to 6 questions, because asking questions shows interest and it shows professionalism. So it actually is a big mistake if you don't have any questions. And at the end of the interview, it's advisable for you to ask about next steps and the timing of the selection process. So then we have the post-interview stage, and this is the waiting period until you either get a job offer or you learn that you were not the successful candidate. And after the first interview, it's possible you could get invited for a second interview. But after each interview, it's important to send a thank you message. These days, it's most often by email. And what you're doing is you're thanking the interviewer for their time. It's interesting how the pandemic has changed some of the practices and the expectations of job interviews, because according to a recent survey that I read, employers care even more about thank you notes than they did before the pandemic. And I have an article on this with lots of very valuable tips. It's part of our resources, so you can just email me to ask for it. But a few of the important tips that I can share with you is, if it was a panel interview, then make sure that you're sending a thank you email to each interviewer. And you want to send these thank you emails within 24 hours of the interview. And in terms of what you write, you want to express appreciation. And if you're interested in the job, make sure that you say that and be specific about why you're interested. And always, always, always make sure that you proofread before you hit send. Next slide, please. So there are many possible styles and mediums and steps in the process, and you need to be prepared for anything. Interviews can be structured where the questions are developed ahead of time, and in that case, everyone would get asked the same questions. But sometimes you see the opposite, where the interview is free-flowing and it feels more like a conversation. And others are somewhere in between. They're semi-structured, and that means that the interviewer has some topics to cover while allowing for new ones depending on each candidate. Sometimes there'll be just one interviewer, other times you'll be interviewed by a few people, and that can include staff from different departments, or you could even be interviewed by the entire team. We do that at Career Services. And finally, you could also be interviewed alongside other applicants, believe it or not. This is called a group interview. So since the pandemic, video interviews have become the norm. Not always, but they're very popular now. And these are usually conducted over a platform like Zoom or another video platform. So you should prepare for this the same way that you would for a face-to-face interview. So some of the tips include, please make sure you test your technology in advance. This includes checking your internet connectivity, checking your camera and your microphone. You can even set up your own Zoom meeting and record yourself as a test and then watch it. Please minimize distractions. Use a space with good lighting or even a blank wall. Make sure you tidy up. It sounds like common sense, but believe it or not everyone is aware of this. And turn off the notifications on all your devices. Don't have the TV on either. Prepare your answers to common interview questions. And the cool thing about having a video interview is that you can even write some key points on sticky notes and put them right on your screen as reminders. And watch your body language. So sit up straight and smile and keep the camera at eye level and dress just as you would for an in-person interview. If you're interviewing for a customer-facing job, it's likely that the interview will be in person. And of course, due to health and safety concerns during the pandemic, these will usually require all of you to wear a mask and to use hand sanitizer and maintain at least 6 feet of physical distance. Sometimes an employer will request an in-person interview as a final step, even for remote positions. So obviously it's important to follow public health guidelines and to not show up to an interview if you're showing any signs or symptoms of illness. You might want to ask to postpone it until you're feeling better. And also, if you don't feel safe to meet in person, you need to honor that, and you can request a virtual interview instead. There's another medium that's becoming more popular. This is really interesting. This is called the asynchronous video interview, or AVI. This is different from virtual interviews in that it doesn't involve any human interaction, I should say, at all, if you can believe it. How it works is applicants receive an email invitation, they click a link, and then they record audio or video responses to the questions. So if you're interested to learn more about this, our resources include an article on this, so just send me an email. Interviews can involve any number of steps. It's quite common to have a brief pre-screening interview over the phone. And if you are invited for that kind of interview, make sure to prepare with just as much effort as a regular interview, because this determines if you get invited for a follow-up interview or not. Some companies hold just one interview, others conduct 2 or 3. I've even heard of more than that. And depending on the position, you could be asked to complete an assignment or prepare a presentation or provide a sample of your work. So as you can see, anything can happen in this process. So it's important to prepare and to keep an open mind. Next slide, please. So of course, you can't predict with any certainty what you'll be asked about during an interview. However, there are some standard interview questions that you should be prepared to answer, and I've listed some of these here on the slide. And next to each one, I've listed the employer's motive for asking this question. In other words, what is it that they want to learn about you? It's important to reflect on this when you're preparing your answers. remembering to always put yourself in the employer's shoes. Be both honest and targeted in your responses, and avoid saying anything that could create doubts for the employer or raise concerns. So I'm going to give you a moment to have a look at these before we advance the slide. And in a little while, I'll give you some sample responses to some of the questions that people find most difficult. Okay, next slide, please. So here's a question for you. I'm really curious to know, which interview question do you think is the hardest? Is it tell me about yourself? Why did you leave your last job? What do you know about us? What are your greatest strengths? What is your biggest weakness? Or tell me about a time when, so that's a behavioral question, or what are your salary expectations? I'm sure that many of you want to check off all of them, but I'm only asking you for which one you think is the hardest. So far, the three most popular answers are, what's your biggest weakness? Tell me about a time when, and what are your salary expectations? I'm going to wait for a few more answers to come in before we move on. Somebody says, tell me about yourself. Okay. Somebody else says, why did you leave your last job? Okay. Very interesting. Well, all of these actually are difficult questions, and we're going to cover some of them. Next slide, please. So, in case you're not aware of it, there are some questions that are actually illegal to ask during a job interview. These are the types of questions that are prohibited according to the Canadian Human Rights Act, because they could lead to discrimination. The only exception to this is where there's a genuine occupational requirement. So, for example, being at least 19 years old might be required to work in a liquor store. So the list of prohibited grounds of discrimination are featured in the blue box in the slide. In interviews, sometimes informal references to some of these topics can come up. So if I give you an example, let's say an interviewer arrives late to the interview and they try to explain why by saying, I'm sorry for the delay, my kid is sick and I was on the phone. Have you got kids? So that's in that category, right? And it's also, unfortunately, possible that an interviewer might make blatantly inappropriate inquiries. So, for example, saying, we're looking for someone committed. Do you plan on having children in the future? And it's up to you to decide in that moment how you want to deal with the situation. Depending on the circumstances, you might not want to stop the interview in its tracks and instead decide to either deflect or even directly answer the question. I would suggest that you trust your instincts in assessing what their intention was, whether innocent or not. And if your decision is to not answer a question like this, you have the option of responding with something like this. And also your tone of voice and body language are important here. That's a very interesting question. I'm wondering how this relates to the position. The trouble with certain inappropriate questions is that even if they were just asking in passing and without any negative intention, this leaves open the question of what role your answers to those questions played in the hiring process, especially if you didn't get hired. So in summary, if an employer asks one of these forbidden questions, it's best to either answer the question as accurately as possible or else politely choose to decline without becoming hostile or defensive. Next slide, please. So how many of you have been asked an illegal question during an interview? An illegal question that you're aware was illegal? I've got a person so far on the chat, yeah, saying that they have been. Yeah, please use Menti to answer this question. Oh, for some reason it's saying that Menti froze. You might want to refresh your screen, or maybe try to re-enter the website address. Hopefully that's just a temporary glitch. Okay. Deirdre, do you want to please repost, or I guess actually at the top of the slide is the address for menti.com. Yeah, it looks like possibly there might be an issue with Menti. Hopefully it doesn't last, but if it does, so be it. Okay. Oh, look, there we are. Okay. So it looks like, okay, most people have not been, but there are also a significant number of people who have been asked an illegal question, which is, you know, in a way unfortunate, but at the same time kind of not surprising, because there's a lot of employers who are simply just not aware that these questions are illegal. Next slide, please. Okay, so one of the most common ways to open an interview is by asking this very open-ended question, which is, tell me about yourself. And it causes a lot of stress for people because it's just so open-ended, and therefore it's very difficult to know what the employer would be interested to hear. And yet your answer to this question is what makes that crucial first impression, and it sets the tone for the entire rest of the interview. So to help you with this, I want to remind you of a couple of points that I covered earlier. The first one is a reminder that with every question, the employer is really asking you, how can you be of value to me? So don't waste this opportunity by talking about your personal life or things that are completely unrelated to the job. And the usual motive for this question includes their curiosity around things like, can you organize your thoughts? Or do you understand what's important to this job? Are you a match for this job? Or are there issues from your background that would interfere with your performance in this job? So the first guideline is to ensure that you take no longer than 60 seconds to answer. You can actually say a lot in 1 minute, and any longer than this is going to come across as rambling. Remember to customize your answer for every job, making sure to not only talk about what you can, or sorry, making sure to only talk about what you can offer that's relevant to the position. And your answer can include things like your related work experience, your education, and any training that's pertinent to the job. A combined total of anywhere between 3 and 5 hard and soft skills. You can talk about a relevant achievement or an award that you're proud of, your relevant strengths, and your current career goal. Remember, I keep on using this word relevant because that's the only thing they're interested in. Next slide, please. So here's an example of a great answer to this question. I have over 8 years of frontline experience in nonprofit agencies, and that includes a total of 5 years experience counseling clients in one-to-one situations. Also, I've presented workshops to youth and families, and I've delivered many presentations over the years. I have great listening and communication skills that have served me well in my roles where I've had to do intake interviews and counseling and case management. I've had great feedback from supervisors and colleagues and clients. They've told me that I'm passionate and that I'm open-minded and committed. And this position interests me because I'd like to support parents in crisis, and I feel confident that my background is an excellent fit. So that takes me about 40 seconds to say. So you see that guideline of a minute actually gives you a lot of opportunity to speak to relevance. Next slide, please. Another type of question that many people find hard is called a behavioral question. They often start with, tell me about a time when, and what they're asking for here is a specific example and not a general answer. Answering without telling a story is a common mistake here. These types of questions can also sometimes be framed using a hypothetical situation. In other words, what would you do if? So here, interviewers want to know what you've done in the past or what you would do in a particular situation that's likely to come up on the job. And the idea behind this is that past behavior is the best predictor of future behavior. These kind of questions often focus on transferable skills relating to your relationships and your ability to manage difficult situations. I'll give you a couple of examples. Tell me about a time when you were asked to meet an impossible deadline. Tell me about a time when you were angry or upset with a customer or client, or can you give me an example of when you had a conflict with a coworker? So, you know, when you think about it, you actually have a big opportunity to shine here. And that opportunity is to tell an accomplishment story. This refers to an example from your past where you may have personally improved a situation or solved a problem or made a contribution that you feel particularly proud of. And there's a recommended format to answer behavioral questions. And an easy way to remember this is the acronym PAR. So P stands for problem. You start out by giving a little bit of context and you tell what the problem or the need was in that situation. Then you move on to the actions, where you state how you did what needed to be done, making sure that you use strong action verbs. And then you conclude with the results. State the specific outcomes. Ideally, you want to talk about results that are tangible and concrete. And it's really important to be selective in choosing stories to tell. Only choose stories that had a positive outcome. You'd be surprised how many people don't realize the importance of this. Telling a story that was either left unresolved or had a negative outcome is going to end up putting you in a negative light, which is the opposite of what you're trying to achieve. Again, make absolutely sure that you give examples and that you don't speak in generalities. Because if you don't give examples, your answers end up sounding like empty claims that are very cliche in nature, and this is not going to sell you. And finally, again, make sure that you can tell your story in 1 to 2 minutes. Next slide, please. So, what strategy can you use if you can't think of an example? Please enter your response in Menti. Do you think you should ask for time to think about it and answer it later? Should you ask if it's okay to use a non-work-related example, or ask what kind of skills they're hoping for so that you can provide an example, or any or all of the above? What do you think? We're seeing very consistent pattern in the responses. Most people are saying any or all of the above. There's one person that's saying ask what kind of skills they're hoping to learn. Okay. So, you know something? Any of these answers is correct, which means that you can either answer any or all of the above, or you can answer any one of those other choices. So there's no wrong answer. Next slide, please. So here's an example of an answer using the PAR format. In answer to the question, tell me about a time when you took initiative to solve a problem. As you can see in this example, the problems are highlighted in yellow, the actions in pink, and the results in blue. So I'll read it out. When I started my last job as a facilitator, the staff had not set up any systems with instructor and participant materials, which made it challenging for me as a new facilitator. And this was back in the day when everyone was keeping manual systems. I took the initiative to create workshop folders with instructor notes and participant materials for their 21 workshops. I volunteered to do this by observing the workshops, taking notes on my laptop, and creating instructor notes in a standardized format. I weeded out the handouts we weren't using anymore and replaced them with some new ones, and we only kept master copies. This streamlined the time it took to prepare the handouts for each new group. It saved around 20 minutes of prep time for workshop, which really added up fast considering that we delivered 21 workshops to each new cohort. And as a result, we were able to hire 1 contractor and 2 practicum students to deliver workshops on a short-term basis with minimal preparation, which previously was not feasible. Okay, next slide, please. So the salary question, most employers will ask you this question, and it's an awkward one for many of us because people just don't like to talk about money, and stating a number feels risky. So remember that you should be prepared to ask for what you want within reason, of course, and I have a few tips for you. Make sure that you know what's possible and what's reasonable by doing your research ahead of time. So if the average salary for a person with your background is $55,000 to $65,000, then negotiate within that range. Present your evidence, ensuring that the employer clearly understands your rationale. So you should be presenting evidence from your research, combined with any expertise or experience that you have that's relevant. And if you happen to get a job offer, be willing to negotiate. A lot of job seekers don't even try to negotiate salary, because there seems to be a belief out there that the salary and benefits being offered are fixed, but this isn't necessarily true. Most employers expect you to negotiate the salary. And don't focus on just the money, but instead consider the full compensation package, including benefits. So salaries are sometimes fixed, but other benefits can be more flexible. And know your bottom line. Or, you can think of this as your walk-away point. Ideally, you'll know your must-haves before even applying for a position, and be very clear with yourself on the specifics that need to be in place at a minimum. And take the time to thoughtfully consider any job offer. Ideally, your offer should be in writing, and if it isn't, you can ask for this, and an offer should lay out the full compensation package and the start date and any other terms. And then once you get the offer, you can thank the employer and ask for a day or 2 to review it. Make sure you don't ask for too much time, and also make sure to respond within the time frame that you asked for. And then finally, it's advised to go for a tie and not a win, because in any negotiation, keep in mind that a win implies that somebody lost, and both parties should come away feeling happy with the terms. Next slide, please. Again, stating a number when you're asked this question can feel risky, because if you come in too high, you might get screened out. This happened to me once last year. Believe it or not, the bottom of my range was 10,000 above the top of theirs. And this was a stellar interview where the interviewers were starting to imply that they wanted to offer me the job. So I ended up concluding that this was the only reason that they didn't end up offering it to me. On the other hand, if you give a number that's too low, it suggests that you're not actually very qualified, or else you're ill-informed, or you don't have much confidence. And people often associate money with quality, so lowballing can also work against you. This delicate issue shows how critically important it is to do your research. Salary information for different occupations is available online on websites like Glassdoor or Indeed, and also on LinkedIn if you have a premium account. Sometimes, if you're lucky, you can find specific salaries for specific jobs with specific companies. Of course, you're in the best bargaining position once you've been offered a job. It's quite common, however, for employers to ask this before the offer stage as a way to screen candidates. So there's 2 possible approaches I would recommend. You could first try seeing if you can get them to name a number first. You could put it like this: I would need to know more about the job before proposing an appropriate salary, and I'll certainly consider your best offer. What range did you have in mind? This may or may not work, and if it's clear that they want you to name a number first, then here's another possible way of answering. I'm open to considering an offer you might make. According to my research, the market value of this job for someone with my qualifications is between X and Y. So this keeps the focus on objective data and your worth within that context. Also, providing a range instead of a specific number gives both of you some wiggle room to negotiate. Remember, though, that you really have to do your homework. Next slide, please. So the best way to get good at interviews is by practicing. If you have an interview coming up, you can schedule a Zoom appointment with one of our career advisors to do a mock interview. This would be a 1-hour appointment consisting of 30 minutes of interviewing, followed by 30 minutes of feedback. And I usually like to record the interview and send it to you after our appointment so that you can see for yourself what I was talking about when I provided the feedback. And I know that watching yourself on video is hard, but it's also one of the best ways to learn about how you come across. So we ask you to help us to help you, because this takes preparation and time on our part. So please give us at least a few days notice and email us the job posting or position description, along with the company website address, plus your resume and cover letter. And with all of this information, we can take some educated guesses about what kind of interview questions you might get. I would also recommend that you do your part to prepare for our mock interview by researching the company and practicing your answers to some common interview questions. That way, we can make our role play simulation as realistic as possible. Most people find this process to be enormously helpful. Next slide, please. I just want to conclude with this quote by Benjamin Franklin. Seems very appropriate. By failing to prepare, you are preparing to fail. Next slide, please. So here is our contact information. We have resources and coaching available at Career Services. You can email us either at careerservices@yorkvilleu.ca or careerservices@torontofilmschool.ca. So that's it for the presentation. I'd like to open it up for questions now.
Thanks so much, Linda. That was great. I think I hope one of the big takeaways for our attendees in amongst so much information is when you said early on that the employer is nervous too, because we so often can be really, really prepared ourselves. And then when we get to the interview and the interviewer is terrible and we haven't quite thought that through. So I thought that was a really important piece of advice to give our attendees, that sometimes the interview is bad because the interviewer is not prepared, or having a bad day, or has maybe never done an interview before.
So true. Yeah.
So we do have, just so everybody knows, it's on the slide, but I also put the emails in the chat a couple of times for you. And we have had a question, Linda, for you. So Ashley asks, I have heard, how have you spent your time during the pandemic? Has been a question asked in a lot of recent interviews. Do you think this question or this type of question is relevant or even ethical? The answer might be quite personal and invasive depending on the person's experience. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, actually, you're quite right. I've read the same thing. That's a really common question that you should be prepared to answer. And, so some of the things they want to learn about you are how resilient you are. So you might want to speak to measures that you've taken for self-care, for example. During the pandemic, a lot of people have invested in continuing their education or pursuing a hobby, perhaps, that they've always wanted to do and never got around to. So, when you can talk about resiliency and personal growth and development and that kind of thing, this is the kind of thing that makes a good impression on employers. Yeah, so it's not, I haven't heard of it being considered unethical, and it is very common. You should be prepared to answer this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Do we have other questions?
Any other questions? Not so far. Getting off easy today.
I'm sure I'm going to get lots of emails though, and that's okay too.
that's okay too. There was a lot of really fantastic information here. And for those of you that are asked, remember we're all YouTube stars at the moment, so we are live streaming this on on our Yorkville University YouTube channel. So you are freely available to go and watch the webinar as many times as you might like, and pause it and take notes and those sorts of things. And of course, if you have missed our other career services webinars, then all of those are there as well. And so you can spend countless hours looking at us on YouTube. Well, maybe not me, I'm not usually there. So another question has come in. Why most companies often ask about the red flag and difficult questions?
Yeah, that's interesting to think about, right? And I think, personally, I think it's because employers, they want to get a full picture of you, and that's difficult to ascertain if they don't know you. And it can be very telling when you start to reveal stories from your past. Remember how I mentioned how it's actually a very expensive and time-consuming process where the employer invests a lot of money and time, and fit and capability are so important. So they want to make sure they're doing their due diligence when they're asking these kind of questions, because sometimes a single red flag can make the difference between getting a job offer and not.
Yeah, that's great. So we've had another question. It's more of a resume question, but I'm gonna fire it to you anyways, Linda.
Sure.
Because I think this is really important for so many of our students. If we don't have any relevant work experience to add to our resume, what can we write so that our resume isn't so blank and empty?
Yeah,
great question.
That is a fantastic question that I see every day. We all do at Career Services. Thank you for asking it. So just because you don't have relevant experience, it doesn't mean that you have nothing to write about in your resume. Because up until this point, you have lived an interesting and rich life with many different experiences where you have just naturally had an opportunity to use your gifts and your skills. So you can write about that. And the trick is to be intentional about it and to do your due diligence in looking at job postings and job descriptions and talking to people in the industry to find out what's important, what matters in the way of skills to employers, so that you're being selective about which skills you feature in your resume. And you can tell amazing and powerful accomplishment stories.
Yeah. And the type of resumes you choose matters as well, right?
Totally.
The type or style of resume. And that's something, if you don't know what that means, we've done a webinar on it, but also the career services team will be really happy to talk to you about that, because that's a strategy as well.
Exactly.
So 2 more questions that have come in.
Sure, go ahead.
So Ashley's Ashley's come back to us. So we that was a good answer, I think, but she's got more questions. So this is and this is so timely with our pandemic. So Ashley, thank you very much. So just to add to that first question, there are people in the pandemic that have experienced a lot of sickness and loss and really struggled. So how do you mention that? Like, can you only talk about good things? How honest is too honest in these kinds of situations, Linda?
Yeah, I love that question, and it's very important. I always believe in being transparent and being honest with people. And remember that you're a human being, and the employer is hiring a human being, and they're a human being. And I think now is a time where there's much more understanding and compassion in the world around these things than there ever was. And so what I would recommend is that you find a way to talk about that kind of a thing, but prepare very thoroughly in advance, and maybe even practice with another person that you know and who you trust to be honest with you, or record yourself on video. And I would say be truthful, but also keep it somewhat brief, because that can be very triggering for you. And you can end up in tears, and you can end up, confiding in the person, and you just want to be careful of those kind of boundaries. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
And you can also, in some cases, if you've done your practice and your prep, really look at, so what did I learn about myself in through this? And so that way you can kind of tag it. And what I learned is I'm much more resilient than I thought I was, or, whatever it might be. But this is a question that definitely, there are questions you're going to get in an interview that you can probably just answer, but there are some that really do need to have some prep and practice. Okay, we've got time for one last question. I've always worked in this as an admin payroll person, and I'm looking to go into project management after my degree. So how do you answer questions like, why did you apply for this job, or why do you think you're qualified for this job, when you really are in career transition? So you're changing from one kind of career to another.
So that is an opportunity to tell a really interesting story. And when I've done mock interviews or interviews with people, I'm always interested to learn that about the person. And let's face it, there is a story there. There's a reason why you got inspired to change careers. And so, as long as it's not an answer, something like, well, I just wanted to do a degree so I could get a better job. If there's something that has to do with your interest and your passion and your motivation, and that sort of thing, then that's a perfectly legitimate and interesting answer to their question.
Yeah, that's right. So that's all the time we have. I'm just going to, rather than reading it out, I was just typing a response in the chat here. And so, I think, Edva, it's probably pretty important that maybe you reach out to career services, but it doesn't matter that maybe only seasonal jobs or temporary jobs, or, those kinds of things. There are so many skills that all of those experiences surface, and we learn things in everything that we do. So it might just take a little bit of help to craft those skill statements into something that's really meaningful, or something that you can share in an interview. Everything that you've done has value, and everything that you've done has developed skills and traits and competencies and all of those sorts of things that employers want. So it's just sometimes working with somebody to tease out the language that employers are looking for.
Exactly.
So everybody, that's it for today for our career services webinar. We'll see you again in 2 weeks for our next session. And I should probably know what that is, but I don't know. Linda, do you know what we're talking about in 2 weeks?
Oh, I'd have to look it up. Alexi or Natalia,
Yeah.
which one of you is up?
Yeah.
Are you on mute?
Be prepared.
I think you're on mute, Alexi.
Yeah, it's developing your career through COVID.
Okay. So that'll be a good one. We'll talk about lots of stuff to do around employability and COVID. I'd also like to invite everybody. Tomorrow is Friday, and it's our Ask an Expert Day. Tomorrow we have Dr. Michael Sorsdahl coming to talk to us about, this should be fun, relationship, sex, and consent. So I don't know how I get myself into these things on YouTube, but there you go. In the meantime, everybody, please don't hesitate to reach out to Career Services if we can do anything for you. We're very glad that you were here today, and all the best for the rest of your day. And for many of us in the country, it's a long weekend. So we'll be back at it tomorrow, and then not till